Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here to mark the anniversary of the Battle of Sullivan's Island on this, our 243rd Carolina Day. I'll have to say first that Father Grimble is a hard act to follow, and he's certainly no anesthesiologist. I think you'll agree. I'd like to thank the Palmetto Society for its kind invitation, and I thank my friend Cal Stevens for his gracious introduction. Celebrated on or about the 28th of June every year since 1777, excepting perhaps the British occupation of Charleston of 1780 to 82, Carolina Day, or Palmetto Day as it was first called, commemorates one of the most important battles and the first significant American victory of our Revolutionary War. Now, battles are customarily studied from a tactical, strategic, or geopolitical standpoint with a focus on the participants, whether they be the officers or the common soldiers of one side or the other, and often both. This morning, I'll certainly touch on strategy and tactics and even throw in a little theology, no geopolitics, but I'd really like to tack away from the lofty abstractions of liberty and independence and instead consider this event, the Battle of Sullivan's Island, as if we were there among the throngs of fretful but patriotic Charleston civilians who watched as the battle raged in the harbor. But first, let's do a little mental arithmetic. Begin with the people of Charleston here on the peninsula on the morning of June 28, 1776. Now let's add to that number everybody around the harbor who was not actually involved in the battle at the fort. Now there were soldiers and citizens over on Mount Pleasant. Colonel William Danger Thompson and his men held breastworks on the north end of Sullivan's Island. They faced British troops across Breach Inlet on what is now Isle of Palms. There were British sailors observing from their ships anchored in 5 Fathom Hole off Morris Island. And there was the garrison of Fort Johnson over on James Island. If you go all around the harbor from the various vantage points, you'll find that there were upwards of 18 to 20,000 spectators nervously awaiting the outcome of a duel between ships of the Royal Navy and a small unfinished fort constructed of sand and palmetto logs. I guess we can't really say that the British were nervous, can we? I imagine that they were smugly confident as their ships approached our little fort. But arguably, the Battle of Sullivan's Island, specifically Sir Peter Parker's naval assault on the fort itself, was the most spectated event in American history until the Yankees fired on Fort Sumter in 1861. Now, parenthetically, I'm not at all discounting the heroics of Danger Thompson and his brave men at the north end of Sullivan's Island. Their role was absolutely critical, but remember, for the purpose of my address this morning, I'm concentrating on what could be seen and heard and known by the inhabitants of Charleston from right about here or close to here in town on the peninsula. Now, nobody would disagree that the battle was important, but in my view, in addition to being one of the most spectated events in American history, it was one of the most, if not the most, dramatic event in American history. I understand if you're thinking, how can you stand up there and say that the Battle of Sullivan's Island was the most dramatic event in American history? The Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston a year earlier in June of 1775 was pretty dramatic. The redcoats coming up the hill, our soldiers being taught, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. That was dramatic. Or Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. That was pretty dramatic. The list could go on. Francis Scott Key watching Fort McHenry and composing the Star-Spangled Banner, or Andrew Jackson at New Orleans during the War of 1812. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Now, I don't care what side of that argument you're on, that was pretty dramatic. Then, of course, there's Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. I'll stop with the end of the 19th century because I think you probably get my point. I've probably overstated. But I think we can all agree that the outcomes of the events that I've just mentioned were never foregone conclusions. In fact, in every example given, the final result was pretty much uncertain from the outset. That's what made them so dramatic. But in no case, more than the Battle of Sullivan's Island was the conclusion so uncertain, the odds against us so great, and the stakes so high. The very idea of defending Sullivan's Island in the minds of some was so far beyond the bounds of conventional wisdom as to make its undertaking foolhardy. Let me restate what I just said because it's important. Many in Charleston rightly believed that defending a fort on Sullivan's Island was a bad idea. And bear with me for a moment while I digress to define the term outcome bias. Having outcome bias means that when we look back at the battle now, knowing how it turned out, an astonishing victory for us, the steps leading up to the battle seem in retrospect to be perfectly reasonable, proper, and correct. My friends, that is not necessarily so. And if we can temporarily set aside our outcome bias, we might appreciate the Battle of Sullivan's Island from the perspective of those watching from here on the peninsula in 1776. So let's set the stage. Ignore the outside heat and humidity for a moment and imagine that it's January 1776. We've heard what the British have been doing in the northern colonies, and we've also learned that a British expeditionary force is headed our way. We don't know what they'll do when they get here or where they'll go, but we know they're coming. And all of these unknowns only heighten our rising apprehension. We will fortify Charleston and the harbor as best we can, given limited time, resources, and experience. And then in due course, we'll build a fort on Sullivan's Island. After all, the channel runs right past. We can at least try to stop the British there if they try to come here to threaten our beloved town, right? But how? How will we do that? Well, for all we know, Palmetto logs have never been used in fortification or tested in battle. But hey, there's plenty of them around here, so we'll do that. That might work. There's little else we can do, but honor demands that we do something. We're not just going to give up. So we fortify, or try to. The British come. They pound our little fort for the better part of a day, and then withdraw after suffering a humiliating defeat. We'll put a tree on our flag to commemorate our success, and we'll observe the anniversary every year with a parade, usually, and the very best speakers, sometimes. Okay, but let's back up a little bit and drill down a little bit deeper. South Carolina troops occupy Sullivan's Island at Christmas time in 1775, and learning that a British force indeed is headed our way, the Council of Safety decides in January 1776 to build a fort out there on Sullivan's Island. The council engages Cornelius DeWeese and others to deliver palmetto logs to the island, as many as they could, as fast as they could, until they were told to stop. And over the coming months, thousands of palmetto logs were rafted over to Sullivan's Island from the mainland. But when Colonel William Moultrie goes out to Sullivan's Island at the beginning of March, he finds that not very much progress has been made. The fort was little more than an outline in the sand with lots of palmetto logs laying around. I can almost imagine Colonel Moultrie sending a note back to the mainland saying, "Friends, I've been out to Sullivan's Island, and it is indeed in a sad, sorry state of affairs." Nonetheless, he and his men, a number of hired artisans from town, and a cadre of enslaved laborers begin work in earnest. Despite their hard work, when the British arrive offshore in June with a fleet of 50 ships and thousands of redcoats, The little Palmetto fort is far from finished, more than halfway maybe, but not much. But this is where we'll make our stand, an unfinished fort. The garrison of 435 men will be outnumbered 4-1. We don't have near enough cannon. Our 31 guns in the fort, of those, perhaps only 20 or so can be brought to bear on an enemy, so we'll face a 7-1 disadvantage in firepower. Our supply of gunpowder is critically short. Even so, our commander, William Moultrie, has refused to give up his fort without a fight. So, who was this William Moultrie? It would take a book to tell that story, trust me on that. But many of us know him. We've known him for years. He's an esteemed and gregarious gentleman who's very popular with his men, but he's unproven as a leader in battle. In reality, Major General Charles Lee of the Continental Army, who was sent by Congress to help us prepare, has mostly negative opinions about Moultrie's leadership ability. Lee considers him lax and criticizes him for fraternizing with his soldiers. Lee almost relieves Moultrie of command on the morning of June 28. Did y'all know that? Almost relieved him of his command, probably would have, but he just couldn't find him to do it, and the battle started. Now, most of what I've just said is common knowledge around town, which doesn't exactly bolster our confidence. Now, what about the common soldiers under Moultrie's command, the men inside the fort, the privates? We hear very little about them. The enlisted soldiers are generally a rough and ragged bunch. Many are immigrants or poor white men of low social standing. Like most of their officers, few, if any of them, had ever come under fire unless they were brawling or shooting at each other. But here's one thing we do know about the enlisted men in the fort, and it's very illustrative if we remember that South Carolina troops were not yet part of the Continental Army. In the Continental Army at the time, certain infractions were punishable by no more than 39 lashes. Okay, that was the maximum punishment. The origin of 39 lashes is actually biblical. In Deuteronomy, Moses says that a guilty person may receive 40 stripes, not more. In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that he received 40 lashes less one. General Lee, however, wrote in a letter that this level of punishment would be, and I'm using his words, too mild for the perverse soldiery of this meridian, to whom 39 lashes would prove but a light breakfast. The data, in fact, shows that when our soldiers misbehave, they often receive way more than 39 lashes. But what does this say about South Carolina's common soldiers in comparison to those from the other colonies? Ours is a tough crowd, but that's what we need right now, isn't it? And without realizing it, Lee has actually paid us a backhanded compliment. Light breakfast indeed. Speaking of Lee, in the end, we'll ignore much of his advice, the wisdom of a soldier considered by some to be a better candidate to command the Continental Army than George Washington. Lee had declared that the fort was a slaughter pen, that it wouldn't hold for half an hour, that the garrison would be inevitably and needlessly sacrificed. He had no confidence in Moultrie or his men or the fort, and he strongly recommended abandoning Sullivan's Island. Even William Moultrie's friend, Ship Captain Clement Lempriere, expressed an opinion, and one shared by many of the sailors around the harbor, that if the British men of war would come alongside the fort, they would knock it down in half an hour. Moultrie replied that if that happened, he and his men would fight from the ruins. He was absolutely committed to defending Sullivan's Island. Let's just momentarily turn our attention to our adversary. The Royal Navy and the British Army appear to be everything that we are not: well supplied, well trained, well armed, and battle tested. Now, taking into account all of these factors, the relative indefensibility of Sullivan's Island compared to the military or the might of the British Empire, what could possibly go wrong, right? So you can see that when we put aside our outcome bias, defending the fort doesn't sound like such a great idea after all, does it? So let's circle back to where we started one more time. Now imagine you are a civilian here in Charleston, a man, woman, or even a child. And as you watch the battle unfold from a rooftop or from a wharf or from atop one of the walls around the waterfront, you are acutely aware of the terrible odds against your friends, your brothers, your sweethearts, your husbands, your fathers inside the fort. You know they are not fully prepared and are overmatched, facing an attack by one of the world's most powerful navies. The Palmetto Fort is not going to be merely battered into submission. There's a very real threat of annihilation. And then what? Will the British sail further into the harbor? Will they demand our surrender? What if they bomb the town or start a fire? Charleston's very, very flammable in those days. Will they land an occupation force? We will fight, won't we? Will we? Then what? Well, once the cannonade begins, we can't really see much of what's happening from where we're watching. The smoke from the guns on both sides covers our view, taking on the appearance of thunderclouds. The muzzle flashes appear as summer lightning in the distance. To quote William Gilmore Simms, the emotions of the heart are visible in array upon our faces, the hope, the fear, the worst agony of all, the dreadful suspense. This is what we see on the faces of our friends and family as we look out into the harbor. A gentleman with a spyglass says he can barely make out our flag through the fort. Well, maybe. It's a long way, but he says he can see it. It's indigo blue with a crescent in the right upper corner. And then it falls, he says. Have we struck our colors? Have we surrendered? No one seems to know. Wait, look, the flag is back up. Take heart, our men fight on. And they did fight on all day long and into the evening, slowly and methodically firing back at the British ships. Finally, to our profound relief, a boat sent by Colonel Moultrie appears through the smoke and the darkness, bringing welcome news that the British ships had quit the fight and our South Carolinians are victorious. More than victorious, actually. Our brave but outnumbered, outgunned, and undersupplied South Carolinians have decimated our British foes. Colonel Moultrie would later say that if he had enough gunpowder, the British would have surely been compelled to strike their colors, or they would have certainly been sunk, because they could not retreat as the wind and tide were against them. General Lee, remember General Lee? Wanted us to abandon the fort, almost sacked Colonel Moultrie. Lee conceded in a letter to the Continental Congress, "I was not acquainted with the merit of these brave fellows." And he wrote that Colonel Moultrie, who he had almost relieved of command, had gained eternal credit. The lesson was clear. Victory, however improbable, against a foe of extraordinary strength was possible. South Carolinians had demonstrated by force of arms that they could and would defend their liberty. And so, it was the first significant military victory of our Revolutionary War and the most dramatic event in American history, at least in my humble opinion. We would later learn of the various factors that contributed to our success that day, among them a cascade of British mistakes, the resiliency of our fort constructed of palmetto logs and sand, and the resolute determination of our men to hold their fort against incredible odds. But there's one very important factor that should not be overlooked, and that is divine providence. Our forebears certainly gave divine providence its place, and so should we. Major Bernard Elliott of the 4th Regiment of Artillery had not fought in the battle, but had watched from the cupola of his home on the corner of Meeting and Queen. He penned a letter to his wife on the day after the battle, invoking Psalm 140. And in closing, let me share what he said. Now, my dear wife, let us not forget to whom we are indebted for this success against our enemy. Let us return God thanks for it. It is He that does all for us. He inspires our officers and men with courage and shields their heads in the day of battle. He is the wonderful God of victory. And to that I can only add, Amen, thank you, and happy Carolina Day.